Abby Fenewald. I'm the events assistant here. And this evening I'm so pleased to welcome Amanda Vaill to discuss her new book, Hotel Florida. The book traces the lives of three couples during the Spanish Civil War, including some rather famous subjects like Ernest Hemingway and Robert Capa. And all of them were living in the Hotel Florida in Madrid, and each character provides a new entrance to the drama of the war. So in this book, Miss Vaill has once again shown herself to be a master of the group biography, following the success of her previous book, Everybody Was So Young, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography. And she's also the author of Somewhere, The Life of Jerome Robbins, for which she received a Guggenheim Fellowship. So Hotel Florida is captivating, and we are so pleased that she is here with us to share it tonight. So please join me in welcoming her to Politics in Prose.
Thank you so much, Abby. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to see such a large and enthusiastic seeming crowd. I hope I don't dull your enthusiasm. I'm particularly happy to be at a store called Politics and Prose because, of course, that is really what this book is about. It's about how people used prose in the pursuit of politics and how politics influenced the prose, I think. But before I start, I would love to just try a little background information here. How many people in this audience know for a certainty what the Spanish Civil War was and when it happened? Okay, I think we'll have just a little quick refresher course here. Imagine, if you will, a closely fought election in a politically polarized country that ends with the party on the left winning a narrow victory and the party on the right being disgusted by the victorious party's politics and policies on such things as entitlements, women's rights, collective bargaining agreements, the separation of church and state, military reform, other things like that. And so they then decide to call out the army and rebel against the government and take the country by force and precipitate thereby a civil war. Now, imagine further that this takes place when there are two belligerent superpowers preparing to square off against each other, and they decide to make this conflict a test of their respective influence and see where that takes them. Well, that is what happened in Spain in 1936 when the so-called nationalists, who were led by Francisco Franco and aided by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, when they rebelled against the democratically elected socialist government, Republican government of Spain. Spain had only been a republic since 1931. France and England, who were traumatized by World War I, and so traumatized by it that they declared non-intervention in this conflict. And the U.S. joined it, and Spain's only ally to defend itself was Soviet Russia, the Soviet Russia of our friend Joseph Stalin. And with friends like him and that, you do not need enemies. A journalist, English journalist at the time, Claude Cockburn of the famous Cockburn journalistic family, said that the Spanish Civil War was the decisive thing of the century. It was the big story. It was the first battle, as many saw it, in a conflict against fascism. And really everybody on either side of the political spectrum wanted to cover this. In the U.S., Ernest Hemingway said to his then friend, John Dos Passos, that this was the best thing for our lousy trade, meaning the journalism trade, that there ever was, and the thing best equipped to handle. He meant he was the best equipped to handle it. But now this war did not just include or attract print journalists. It also attracted photographers and filmmakers, because this is the first war where, first of all, people might possibly be allowed to get on the battlefield if they were a journalist. But much, much more important, they had cameras and film that could go there. Before, you never had this. You had big, cumbersome cameras, and they had to be reloaded, and they had to be this, and they had to be that. You had suddenly 35 millimeter film for still cameras. You had little portable IMO movie cameras that you could literally take into the field. And you had film that was fast enough to take pictures under these circumstances. So, Hotel Florida, or I should say, actually properly in Spanish, Hotel Florida, tells what happens to some of these journalists, the writers and the photographers who came to cover the decisive thing in Spain, or who, because they lived there, were even more invested in what was going to go on there. People who really had something to lose if things went sour. All of them learned, or they failed to learn, important lessons about truth and honesty. Truth in reporting not what you hope will happen or not what you think should have happened, but what really has happened. And honesty to each other, if you're in a couple, honesty to your friends, and honesty with yourself about who you are and what you're doing. In writing this, I focused on two pairs of foreigners, Gerda Taro and Robert Capa. Gerda Taro, who was Robert Capa's lover and his comrade in photography, and Ernest Hemingway and Martha Gellhorn, who famously ran off to Spain to have an affair and report on the war. And a Spaniard, Arturo Barea, who was a patent engineer when the war started, who volunteered to serve as a censor. What the censor was, in this case, was actually the head of the Foreign Press Office. He not only stopped things from going out, he let them go out. So you have to remember that distinction. Arturo Barea and the woman he fell in love with, Ilse Kolchar, who was his deputy, a Viennese who had come to help the war effort. Barea lost his country and very nearly his life in an effort to tell what was really going on. All of these people knew each other, and that was an important thing for me. I wanted to have some kind of narrative continuity. I wanted to write a narrative, not a sequential or schematic history of the war. And I didn't want to write a triptych or whatever it would be if there were 6 people in it. I wanted to write a narrative in which you would follow first one person and then another, but they had to obviously know each other and their paths had to cross for me to tell such a story. I wrote about journalists and photojournalists because the issues of truth and honesty really come to the fore in talking about them and telling their stories. But I also did it because they left incredibly full records, diaries, letters, photographs. If you want to write a story about something, you go to somebody who already thinks about writing stories because they put everything down. And as a result, I had incredible, incredible sources. The reason that people have said this book reads like a novel, and they have, is that the writers gave me the material. And all of it, everything in this book, including the quotes and the times when I'm talking about what people are thinking, comes from them. It's not made up, I have to tell you. So I'd like to share with you 3 passages from the first section of the book that place the characters that I am talking about at the beginning of the process of discovery that they make in this book. The first excerpt takes place in the early fall of 1936 when 2 unknown young photographers who were partners in love as well as professionally arrive in Spain to take pictures for one of the new photo news magazines that are becoming popular. Both of them were refugees from the Nazis. They'd been living in Paris, where they made up these sexy new names for themselves, Robert Capa and Gerda Taro, because their original names were either too ethnic or too unpronounceable for them to get jobs. They were both looking for dramatic photographs, and they have come to Spain, traveling first to Barcelona and then to Madrid and then to the Cordoba front in search of them. But they have been shut out at every opportunity. Either people wouldn't let them get to the front, or when they got there, nothing was happening. And so what they had to do, which everybody did, was to stage photographs. You would go to a detachment of soldiers. They'd be standing around doing nothing, and you would say, take those guns, pretend like you're shooting, run down that field, and just show me what you would do if you were doing it. And then you would take a picture of it, and you would send it back to Life or Vue or whatever, and you would have a picture. So this is not thought of at that point as lying. It's not thought of as faking. It's just thought of as how you do your business. So at the Battle of Cerro Muriano, where Taro and Capa went, they were still unable, although they were actually at a battle, to get any photographs that they wanted. So one morning, Capa and Gerda drove 30 miles southwest of Montoro, across the Guadalquivir, and through rolling hills covered by wheat fields, bare now after the harvest, until they reached the camp of a small detachment of loyalist militia just outside the farming village of Espejo. The journey wasn't without danger. Just a few days earlier, another journalist, René Lafont, had been fatally shot in an insurgent ambush nearby. But they reached their destination without incident. It was still early when they got there, and the sun made long, sharp shadows on the dry ground. The milicianos, men from the Murcian village of Alcoy, were happy to pose for the two young photographers, the dark, tassel-haired boy with a ready laugh and the pretty blonde girl. They were 22 in Capa's case and 26 at this point. They ran up one of the bare hills in a combat crouch with their officer beckoning them on, knelt on the grass to aim their rifles at a distant target on the next hill, stood at the edge of a dusty trench and brandished their guns in a show of macho bravado. Then Taro and Capa squatted in the trench as the soldiers ran down the hill towards it and leapt across before taking up firing positions on its further lip. The photographers closed in on them with both the Rolleiflex and the Leica as the men fired their guns into the empty air. The brightness of the sun, still low in the sky, lit the soldiers like a Klieg light and threw every detail from the lumps of soil to the stitching on the men's caps into crisp relief. Finally, it seems it must have been finally, given what happened next, either Capa or Taro asked if some of the milicianos would simulate being hit by gunfire. One, a dark, mustached man in a khaki boiler suit, ran down the hill towards Capa and then, pretending he'd been shot, threw himself on the ground, hanging onto his rifle and breaking his fall with his left hand before coming to rest on his back with his gun across his body. Two others simulated corpses lying on their sides in the stubble. Perhaps Capa wasn't sure he'd got what he wanted, though, or maybe one of the other men wanted a turn in the limelight. However it was, another soldier, with a lean, creased face and heavy black brows, his shirt white under the straps of his leather cartridge boxes, came down the sunlit slope, his rifle in his right hand, the rope soles of his shoes crunching in the dry grass. And then what? Was there a report? The sharp crack of rifle fire? Because suddenly the man's legs went slack, his hands limp. With his rifle flying away from his loosened fingers, he too dropped to the ground, just where his comrades had been moments previously. And in the seconds before the soldier fell, Capa squeezed the shutter of his Leica and took what would become one of the most famous photographs in the world. What really happened on that hillside? Capa himself maintained almost total silence about it, although a year later, a friend, acting as his interpreter for an interview with a New York newspaper, would give a highly colored account that places Capa and the white-shirted soldier alone on a hilltop, hiding in a trench from enemy gunfire until the militiaman attempts to break away to rejoin his detachment and is felled by the blast of a machine gun. A thrilling story, but one belied by the presence of Gerda and of the other soldiers, and by the other militiamen lying on the grass, by the difficulty of machine gun bullets pinpointing a single target more than 100 yards away across mown fields. 10 years later, in a radio interview, Capa embroidered the newspaper story slightly. There had been 20 militiamen in the trench with him, he said, facing machine gun fire from a neighboring hill. One by one, the soldiers had surged out of the trench, only to be felled by enemy bullets, and Capa had got the last lucky shot by holding the camera above his head, never actually seeing the image in the frame. But this narrative, too, is hard to square with the details of the actual photographs he took. Sometime in the 1940s, however, Capa would privately tell another friend, a fellow photographer from Stuttgart, Goethe's hometown, that he and Goethe and the soldiers had all been actors in a tragedy of coincidence. They'd been fooling around, he said, running, firing their weapons, acting crazy, laughing. This is how we'll shoot those fascist bastards. And he'd been taking pictures. He didn't hear any shots, not at first. But as the soldiers played at combat, for the benefit of his camera, a real bullet, fired perhaps from a fascist sniper's high-powered hunting rifle or by one of the rebel Guardia Civil active in those hills, had pierced a real man's heart. Confiding this story all those years later, Capa, his friend would say, seemed stricken, dejected, and defensive like a beaten puppy. No wonder. Even at 22, he was tender and compassionate, and he'd never seen death, especially not a death of his own making. Although he might have been an indifferent bar mitzvah student, never bothering to remember all the stories and rituals his family's rabbi had tried to teach him at 13, he'd surely learned that when he became a man, he took on responsibility for all his sins, and this would have been a heavy one. But what if the man in the photograph simply got up from the ground after the shutter clicked and dusted himself off and went on his way alive and well? Questioned about this possibility 6 decades after the fact, a homicide detective and forensics expert was dismissive. The slackened limbs and fingers looked like death to him, not mimicry. The other men lying on the ground might have been play acting, but this, the detective maintained, was the real thing. Whether it was or not, however, a conundrum remained. Capa had come to Spain to capture the truth, to take the truest, best pictures, pictures that would show how the Spanish people were fighting for their ideals, pictures he would pursue without regard for personal risk. If the photographs from Espejo were staged, even though one of them might have been transformed by dreadful irony into reality, then the only one who had been at risk when they were taken was the man who had stopped a bullet. After Espejo, neither Capa nor Taro let that happen again. So it was after this that Capa formulated his famous philosophy: if your pictures aren't any good, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. A philosophy that had fateful consequences both for Capa and for Taro, as you will discover. But let us move on. By the beginning of November, in the year of which I write, nationalist armies were poised at the outskirts of Madrid, and the government had retreated to Valencia on the coast. So you had nationalist armies like encircling practically the city. And Barea, in the office of the censor, who controlled all the foreign reports of the war, was left alone to man the barricades, all by himself. Miraculously, however, the foreign international brigades, newly formed, and the citizen militias of Spain were able to stop the nationalist advance, and they saved Madrid, at least for the moment. But just as everybody else was running away from Madrid, all the government was running away from Madrid to Valencia, an Austrian journalist, Ilse Kulchar, hitched a ride there with a bunch of other foreign correspondents who they all wanted the inside scoop about what was going on. And they arrived at the Telefonica, the Madrid skyscraper, that's the HQ of all the foreign journalists and of the foreign press censorship, just as an air raid was about to start. When Ilse and the journalists arrived at the Telefonica, they discovered that conditions in Madrid were far more dangerous than they had realized. Yes, the militia and the international brigades had stopped the insurgent advance through the scrublands of the Casa de Campo, but in compensation, the rebel forces had stepped up their bombing attacks on the city, and they had added incendiary bombs whose sheets of white fire gutted buildings and spread panic among the population to their arsenal of destruction. Air raid sirens wailed in the darkened streets as Ilse and the others got into the elevator, standing shoulder to shoulder in the cramped space. As the lift groaned upwards, Ilse found herself wondering what would happen if a bomb hit while they were in it, and looking at one of her companions who had begun to perspire profusely despite the cold, she knew he was thinking the same thing. On the 5th floor, they groped their way along the dark passages until they came to a windowless vestibule where the censor had taken refuge from the possibility of flying glass in the outside offices and was reading reports by the uncertain beam of his flashlight. Ilse saw a tall man with a long, sallow face, sculpted cheekbones, arched brows, a full but sardonic mouth. His thin frame was wrapped in a shabby tweed overcoat against the cold, and he was wearing a black working man's beret with a 5-pointed Russian star on it. He looked up at the journalists with impatience. Couldn't they keep quiet while a raid was going on? Eventually, the bomb stopped falling, and the censor ushered the little group into his office. They all identified themselves and shook hands. Barea looked the newcomers over in the dim violet glow of his lamp. The men he knew by sight or reputation. The woman, whose name he couldn't pronounce, was a stranger. Too round for his taste, he thought. Big green eyes like a cat's, pointed chin, stubborn, lots of dark curly hair, broad shoulders. He dismissed her as no beauty and unfashionably dressed to boot. Why the hell did they send him a woman? She'd have to wait to be assigned a billet, he said, in his fluent but badly accented French, the only common language between him and the journalists. First, he had to look over reports of the raid just passed and clear them for transmission. The men left, and Ilse sat down on the other side of his table, watching in silence as he struggled to translate the unfamiliar words for the horrors the war was causing. He almost forgot she was there until he heard her husky voice. "Can I help you with anything, camarade?" she asked in French. He surprised himself by handing her the dispatch he was working on. He told himself it was to see what she'd do with it, and surprised himself again by taking her advice about some of the language in it. Then he endorsed her papers, gave her a room assignment at the Granvilla Hotel just across the street, and rose to shake her hand. But he addressed her formally as Señorita, and when he did so, her face broke into a mischievous little girl grin. "He shouldn't call anyone Señorita," she said. "We're all comrades here," and marched off down the hall, her shoulders squared in her severely cut coat. She came back the next morning to get her safe conduct, which would allow her to go freely about the city as long as she gave the password of the day to the sentries. And Barea asked her a little about herself. She told him of her hatred of fascism, her undercover work in Vienna, her university background, her travels, the 8 languages she knew. And Barea felt both dismissive and resentful of her erudition and her passion. Who needs a blue stocking like this in a war zone, he thought. Ilse, however, had a proposition for him. Wouldn't it be useful to have someone working in his office who could read the correspondence reports in their native language and talk to them about what cuts or changes were needed? Wouldn't it save time? Wouldn't it serve the cause better to have a spokesperson who could speak directly to the journalists? And by that evening, Barea and Ilse were working across from each other at the big desk in his office. He began explaining the rules. Anything negative had to be suppressed. No mention could be made of defeats, setbacks, catastrophes, shortages, or anything that would give a picture of what life was really like in a besieged city where aircraft rained destruction every night. And Ilse, who wasn't used to being coy or deferential to male colleagues if she disagreed with them, told him flat out that such a strategy was wrong. Catastrophically wrong, she said. It made the government's losses inexplicable. What they should be giving the foreign press was more information, not less. If a bomb falls, tell them the make and give them the factory identification number if possible. Put as much into the dispatches as you can so people understand what's really happening here. Make them see the true collective spirit in Madrid's struggle. Make a propaganda for the new out of the dirt and the blood. Instead of resenting her insubordination, her assumption, which a Spanish woman would never have made, that she had as much right to speak as he did, Barea was perversely exhilarated. What she was saying was what he'd felt all along and had so often repressed, and now it seemed he might have an ally and a co-worker agreeing with him. Excitedly, they pushed the idea this way and that. Perhaps together they might have a chance to persuade their superiors to change their tactics. And they could try anyway. Ilse didn't go back to the Granvilla Hotel that night. She had hated lying in bed, listening for the sound of the Junkers and Capronis in the sky above, and watching her window light up with the glare of incendiary bombs. So Barea offered her the 3rd camp bed in the office, Luis, the young orderly who ran the censor's errands, was snoring in the other one. And she and he took turns sleeping and censoring until morning. They spent all day working and listening to the rumble of firing from the trenches, only a tram ride away at the northwest of the city. And after midnight, they dozed on their camp beds. Suddenly, during what was normally a quiet time between 3 and 5, they heard the insidious purr of a bomber directly overhead. Ilse sat up. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. Luis wasn't there. Perhaps he'd gone down to the shelter. "Nothing," Berea replied. Seconds ticked by. The explosion seemed to take place within the room itself. The furniture jumped, the floor swayed, and there was a sucking roar, then a tinkling arpeggio as the windows shattered and the blackout curtains were blown inwards by the draft. The bomb had fallen on a building 20 yards away in the Calle de Hortaleza and completely demolished it. Outside in the street, there was a flurry of cries and the sound of bricks and plaster falling. Neither Berea nor Ilse could speak for a moment. Then Ilse came and sat on Berea's bed, and they began talking about anything, as if by doing so they could prove to themselves that they were still alive. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, two people are meeting in what is a critical moment in their lives. Ernest Hemingway, bored with his marriage to Pauline Pfeiffer and the life he shares with her, feels at a creative and reputational standstill. His last two books have not been so successful. They have come in for a fair amount of critical roughing up. And he has watched his good friend, John Dos Passos, whom he has usually patronized, suddenly take over the limelight, become the author of the moment, have his face on the cover of Time magazine, while Hemingway is nursing his grudges in Key West, Florida. So he's toying with an offer from the North American Newspaper Alliance, which I will refer to as NANA, because that is what they called it, to cover the war in Spain, and also to write the voiceover for a documentary about Spain to be produced by a group called Contemporary Historians, with which the aforementioned Dos Passos is also associated. Martha Gellhorn, a bright young thing who's a protege of Eleanor Roosevelt and the ex-girlfriend of the stepson of the French novelist Colette, has yet to deliver on her promise. She's having trouble with a new novel, and she is looking for something that will take her life and her career to the next level. It was Martha's mother who saw the sign, Sloppy Joe's Bar, painted on the white stucco wall, and suggested that the three of them go in out of the sun for a drink. Having an afternoon cocktail in a conch bar was the furthest thing imaginable from the way they'd always spent the Christmas holidays back in St. Louis. But on this Christmas, the first since Martha's father had died, they wanted to do something different. And sleepy, shabby Key West, as far south as you could get in the continental United States, was certainly different. The cafe was dim and cool, with sawdust on the floor and a long, curving bar presided over by a 300-pound African-American barkeep, Big Jimmy Skinner. At one end of the bar, reading his mail, was a burly, dark-haired man in a T-shirt and dirty white shorts held aloft by a length of rope. He looked up as the trio came in. The earnest young man, Martha's brother Alfred, on vacation from medical school. The silver-haired, still beautiful Edna Gellhorn, and Martha, tanned and tawny-maned in a little black sundress that showed off her racehorse figure to advantage. Later, he would say he'd figured that Alfred and Martha were a couple, and that given 3 days, he could win the beautiful blonde away from the young punk. But that turned out not to be necessary, because the blonde came over to him, hand outstretched, and introduced herself and her companions to Ernest Hemingway. He had been her writing lodestar forever, her glorious idol. Hadn't she kept his photograph tacked to her dorm room wall at Bryn Mawr? Hadn't she taken the epigraph for her first novel, Nothing ever happens to the brave, from A Farewell to Arms. So imagine how thrilled she was just to walk into a bar in Key West and stumble over him this way. The social preliminaries were quickly dispensed with. Hemingway charmingly pointed out that his wives had both gone to school in St. Louis, and he'd spent considerable time there himself in his youth. He'd be delighted to show these St. Louisans around Key West and make sure they found all the best beaches and watering holes. Drinks came as they talked, then more drinks and more talk. At length, a friend of Hemingway's, Charles Thompson, appeared in the bar, sent by Pauline, who had laid on a splendid crayfish dinner for the Thompsons and was wondering why her husband hadn't shown up for it. He'd have to skip dinner, Hemingway said. Thompson should just tell Pauline to meet up with him later. Thompson looked around Hemingway's table, took in the blonde hair and the black dress, and did as he was told. Over the next weeks, Hemingway made good on his offer to the Gellhorns, and when Alfred's medical school vacation ended and mother and son returned to St. Louis, Martha remained at the Colonial Hotel on Duval Street for nearly a fortnight, and became, as she herself described it in a thank you note to Pauline, a fixture like a kudu head in the Hemingway's house. Hemingway took her swimming and bar hopping, but mostly they just talked about his writing, her writing, the conflict in Spain. She began calling him Ernestino, and he called her daughter, a moniker he frequently bestowed on women even slightly younger than himself, and one that seemed more than usually apt for Martha, who with her long blonde bob and coltish limbs looked even less than 28. The two of them cut a striking figure around the sleepy little fishing town, she in her Riviera resort clothes and he in his scruffy shorts and rope-soled shoes, and the effect wasn't lost on Pauline Hemingway, or Pauline Cutie, as Martha addressed her in her thank you note, a salutation which must have set Mrs. Hemingway's teeth on edge. "I suppose Ernest is busy again, helping Miss Gellhorn with her writing," Pauline said dryly to a friend who had remarked on Hemingway's absence from some occasion. Pauline knew what had come into her and Hemingway's perfectly constructed life. Later, Hemingway himself described it. The oldest trick there is, an unmarried young woman becomes the temporary best friend of another young woman who is married, and then unknowingly, innocently, and unrelentingly, she sets out to marry the husband. Pauline Cutie. Martha Gellhorn was the literary girl of the moment, with her sharp new book whose style was being compared to Hemingway's. She was pretty, well-educated, well-connected, and she was conversant in a way no one else in their circle was with the European political situation that Hemingway was more and more obsessed by. When the two of them started talking about the Spanish War, which Martha said she was desperate to experience at firsthand, the possibility that Hemingway would actually go over to cover it, something Pauline was both politically and personally opposed to, became worryingly acute. Worse, the probability was extreme that he would act, perhaps was already acting, on his evident attraction for this new girl. "I'm a fool with women," he confessed sheepishly to a friend in a conversation of which Martha was the subtext. "I always feel I have to marry him." And Martha? Martha herself was dangerously entranced. Hemingway's attentions were so flattering that she couldn't help boasting about them just a little in her letters to Mrs. Roosevelt. Unlike the cerebral, even effete men she'd previously been involved with, he was a paradigm of machismo, seeing battle in Italy, steering his boat through hurricanes, running with the bulls in Pamplona, shooting sharks with machine guns. He didn't just talk about his anti-fascist principles. He'd already put his money where his mouth was, paying the passage for 2 volunteers who were going to Spain to join the international brigades and borrowing $1,500 to buy ambulances for the medical bureau of the American Friends for Spanish Democracy. And now, when they discussed the news from Europe, he agreed with her, as she told the First Lady, who must have wondered what to do with such confidences. Suddenly, there seemed terribly little time to do anything, that they had to work all day and all night and live too, and love as many people as one can find, and do all this terribly fast because the time is getting shorter and shorter every day. When Martha finally left Key West for St. Louis, Hemingway, having somewhat hastily arranged a business trip to New York to talk to John Wheeler of Nana, followed her. They met up, in Miami, where he took her out for a steak dinner and they boarded the northbound sleeper together. Although Martha changed trains along the route to go west, they stayed in close touch by mail and telephone. Hemingway, lonely for her and excited about the adventures he wanted them to have together, called her from New York often several times a day. He decided to accept Nana's offer to do reportage from Spain, and he thought he could help her get an assignment there too. Of course, there might be problems obtaining visas because of the Non-Intervention Pact, which forbade civilian travel to Spain, but they could find ways around that. Martha had finally found the fresh start she'd been yearning for, and she entered into these plans with gusto. "This is very private," she said to Hemingway in a letter about their arrangements. "We're conspirators, and I have personally got myself a beard and a pair of dark glasses. We will both say nothing and look strong." Her new novel was finished, but on rereading it, she was unhappy with the result and buried the manuscript in a desk drawer. She didn't care about it anyway. She had other things to do now. "Me, I am going to Spain with the boys," she wrote to a friend. "I don't know who the boys are, but I'm going with them." Well, without giving anything away, I can tell you that, of course, nothing turns out the way any of these people had hoped. And certainly not the way the Spanish government had hoped. Lives, battles, friendships, all were lost, including that between Hemingway and John Dos Passos, who came to Spain to work with Hemingway and the Dutch director Joris Evans on that documentary, The Spanish Earth, and ended up falling out with Hemingway over the way the Republican government's ideals seemed compromised by the government's forced alliance with the Soviets. "The party," said Dos Passos, "has climbed into the shell of the Republic and is eating it up the way a starfish eats an oyster." John Dos Passos' grandson is here tonight, and I would like to acknowledge him. His presence underlines something that's painfully true. Although the Spanish Civil War may be vague in some of our minds or forgotten by many, the issues that course through it are still with us, as is evident in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Egypt, in Syria, in the Crimea. And how we meet those issues is for us the decisive thing, as it was for the people in this book. As Ernest Hemingway said in a passage I quoted in one of my epigraphs, "You could learn as much at the Hotel Florida in those years as you could anywhere in the world." Or, as another of my epigraph puts it, "For what is a man profited if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Thank you. I would love to take questions if you have them.
Yeah, we do have some time for questions, so if you could come to one of our two microphones to ask.
Oh, you're so intelligent. You have nothing to, oh, no, good. Okay, yes, come.
Hi, I have a question,
Yeah.
not about the content of your book, but the way you work with your craft. So with a book with so many sources and there's lots and lots of things for you to research. How do you do that? And still, that could take years and years and years.
I ask myself that question every time I start a
So
book.
I'm very curious. What is your strategy for that?
I collect string. That is kind of what I call it. I am totally dependent on being able to write where I have access to sources. I would be useless writing an adversarial outside biography because I would just feel shut out. I want to know, what were they thinking? What were they writing? What were they saying? What was going on behind the scenes? And you're never going to find that out if you don't have access to your subject's papers or whatever else they might have left for you. In the case of Robert Capa, what it was rolls and rolls of film, much of which had been rediscovered after decades in Mexico City, untouched since the Spanish Civil War, where I was able to see exactly where he had been and what he had done. I look at all of this stuff and I collect string. I take everything that looks like it might be interesting and I kind of put it in a big heap. And then I take it out and I try to make a picture out of it. Well, not string, I mean mosaic pieces or something. And in the case of this book, it was really, really complicated because I had 6 people, 3 couples, they're all coming in and out of things. I had a huge cast of supporting characters, some of them really very substantial. And I had this war going on and all this stuff happening in Europe, all of which, was influencing what was going on in Spain, or at least affecting the people who were there. So I made a timeline, and like I used to do in school, and I had across the top of it, I had every single month in the war from July 1936 until April of 1939 when it was over. And then down one side, I had every single person that was major in the book. And I put in each month something that had happened not everything that had happened, that I had been able to get together, or a little tiny, like a note to remind me of a letter or a diary entry or something. So I could then go and put it all together. And it was kind of mind-boggling, but I've never outlined a book in my life before, ever. And this is the first one, and because I had to, and it was actually as I was outlining it that the story finally clicked into place. It was very interesting. Thank you for asking that question. Yeah.
Hello. First, I really enjoyed Everybody Was So Young. It was a great book, and this seems like a good
And some of those
successor.
people appear in this book, too, including Gerald and Sarah Murphy, who have a cameo. They come in.
Oh, good. And Hemingway was a cameo in the earlier one, not a very well-liked one, as I recall. You said something early on, and then I guess you partially answered it, but you said something to the effect of, well, these people all wrote so much, so we know what really happened. But a lot of these were fiction writers and
Yes,
people
they
who...
were. Well, so it is my experience. Fiction writers, when they are writing for themselves, are often extremely truthful because they're actually trying to capture the moment. And they want to use it. It's material, and they want to retain this. So that stuff is gold, 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 highest quality. Then, yes, sometimes they will sculpt it, and they will make it into fiction. And indeed, I used some of John Dos Passos wrote a fictionalized version of some of these events. I was able, however, to check at least the factual parts of those events against other sources, which is something, again, I felt sometimes like, a DA building a case, because I would go, well, he's got an alibi for that night. He says he does. Well, let's see, who else is going to give him one? And I would be looking to see who else would say the same thing. So whenever I had that, I felt like, well, okay, you can say that happened. The color that comes in, thank you, that's the novelist maybe gave it to me, but I don't think a lot of that stuff I basically took on faith because I felt like the color was not something they would necessarily lie about. They might lie about the facts because those are the things that you might want to cover up or change to fit your story. But the color that you remembered, you're not going to throw that away. That was the stuff that you wanted to keep. So I use that.
Okay, well, I guess in the Capa story, you certainly looked into...
That is almost the most analytic I get in the book. Not the only time, but it was that picture, which so many people have weighed in the balance. I felt like I had to, say something about it. I really had to, get out there ahead of it and say something. And I looked at all the prints of it. There are no negatives of that shot. There is no roll or even contact sheet of the surrounding photographs. An awful lot of what he did in Spain was lost. And when the pictures that were saved and became part of the famous Mexican suitcase were grabbed at random off of the shelves of his darkroom in 1940 when the Germans invaded by his darkroom assistant and just shipped out of the country. And, the negatives with the falling soldier were probably left and ended up in the garbage can. Horrible story. Anyone else?
Yeah, my wife's father was in Spain. He was in the Lincoln Brigade.
Yeah.
And he had a lot of stories. He met Hemingway, said he was arrogant. Big
Really?
surprise.
I'm so surprised.
Came back with a love of spicy food, which my wife has now. I'm wondering if you saw the movie, and you must have, on HBO, about Gellhorn and Hemingway, and what you thought.
That film came out when I was deeply in this book. And I could not bring myself to watch it on television, but I'm an Emmy voter. So, because I wrote a screenplay for a documentary about Jerome Robbins that won an Emmy. So I get to get all these great things for my consideration. And that thing sat on my desk, the DVD of it, and I kept looking, and I finally thought, well, I'll peek at it. And that was something where a lot was made up. I mean, Martha
really?
rolling up to the hotel in a tank? I mean, first of all, the tanks they had in those days, one person could sit inside those tanks. They didn't even do their research. Anyway, I rest my case. Nonsense.
Well,
It was a very Martha-centric, glorified. You know, Martha was an extremely brave woman and a wonderful observer of things. And she was also not above manipulating things, sometimes later, to make them more interesting, more favorable, more something, as you will see if you read the book. I don't want to give anything away.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Is that it? Oh, no. Here's someone.
Struggling to try to come up with a good question to ask him. Actually, one question was mine that you asked in a very diplomatic way. I was going to ask in a less diplomatic way.
Oh.
And I didn't want to do that, so I decided I just wouldn't ask the question.
Okay.
And this one I just sort of came up with on the spur of the moment. But I'm just wondering, from the fascist side here at the time or since, has there been any... Is there stuff of literary quality or of good quality out there that sort of looks at the same events from the other side, either
Most
among
of the
Germans or
literature
Italians
from the
or
nationalist
whatever?
side, the nationalist side, most of the literature about the war that would come from that point of view has mostly been written after the events, and a lot of it is in Spanish. And there's a very good novelist called Javier Cercas who wrote a wonderful novel called in English Soldiers of Salamis that you can probably buy here, which is about one of the fascist leaders. It's a very sympathetic and interesting book. It explores, I think, in a very nuanced way, really both sides of this story. During the war, the nationalists severely restricted any coverage of anything by anybody. They only wanted, they only wanted people who were favorable to them. Ditto, really, the Republicans. They only wanted the people who would be sympathetic to their point of view. But they were very much more restrictive, as it turned out, than the Republicans were. And as a result, really not very much got out. So the material was pretty sparse. And I basically decided when I was writing this book that I wanted to focus on people whose paths would cross. So I was kind of stuck with the Republicans no matter what. So.
Right.
That's the way it is.
Thanks. That's
the other book remains to be written.
exactly what I was looking for. Thank you.
Thank you.
What was that title again?
Soldiers of Salamis, Salamis. And his name is spelled Cercas, Javier. And it's really, really terrific book. Anybody? Okay. Thank you so much.